What can we call Taiwan? A country, a breakaway province, or just an island? We'll talk about the options and the impacts on Chinese-American relations next on Global Perspectives.
This program is made possible, in part, by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India Center at UCF.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. The American presidential campaign was not the only hard-fought political battle this year. Half a world away, an equally passionate campaign resulted in the re-election of the president of Taiwan, the island that has been a challenge for American presidents since 1949. Our guest today, Shelley Rigger, will help us understand the origins of modern Taiwan and its role in American-Chinese relations. Welcome to the show, Dr. Rigger.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So you were actually in Taiwan during the week of the election. Tell us a little bit about what it was like.
Well, this election was one that kind of taught me a little lesson, which is if you think you understand something, go with your gut a little bit, because going into the election, I thought, surely President Ma is going to be reelected. There were a lot of reasons to expect that. But when I got there, there was so much enthusiasm in the opposition campaign and so much what looked to me like anxiety in President Ma's campaign that I really got caught up in the possibility that there was a real upset in the offing. But in the end, it pretty much fell true to form, and President Ma was reelected, not by as big a margin as he won the first time, but a healthy margin nonetheless.
Were there any surprises for you in the election and the aftermath?
I think the biggest surprise for me was that the opposition party really was unable to articulate a position on the most important issue in Taiwan's policy environment that could compete with the ruling party or the governing party up to then. And I think that what that was politics within the opposition party, but it really hurt their chances in the election. And I expected that they would somehow figure that out a little sooner than they did.
Now, as we said, this has been an issue since 1949. Help us understand the context. What is Taiwan and why is this a contentious issue?
Sure. So Taiwan is an island off the coast of China, and it has been settled over centuries by people from China. But before the people from China got there, there were already people living there. So you have, in a sense, a kind of geologic formation, you know, with strata of cultures and peoples in Taiwan. The bottom strata, which is very thin but culturally very important to Taiwan, are what are known as the Aboriginal people who came from the Philippines, from the South Pacific Islands. Then you have a much thicker strata of ethnic Chinese who came to Taiwan between about the mid-1500s to the late 1800s. Then there's a layer that's Japanese influenced, because from 1895 to 1945, Taiwan was a Japanese colony. And the whole time that modern China was forming itself, right, the whole kind of crucial era of Chinese nation building at the end of the Qing dynasty and the beginning of the Republican era, the Republic of China period after the Qing fell, Taiwanese missed all of that. They were, subjects of the Emperor of Japan and pretty well integrated into the Japanese Empire. Fast forward to 1945, the Japanese Empire is dissolved and the island of Taiwan handed back to China. But Taiwanese people had already really kind of formed a sense of themselves and of their society that was quite a bit removed from mainland China. So there were a lot of difficulties in the early years that the Chinese government was ruling in Taiwan. And then in 1949, the Republic of China government fell. They were overthrown by the Chinese Communist Party. They lost their civil war. moved lock, stock, and barrel to Taiwan and set themselves up there and said, okay, now we're in charge here, and our job here is to prepare this island to go back and liberate mainland China from communism. And for several decades, there was an authoritarian regime in Taiwan. Taiwanese people couldn't really challenge that. But most Taiwanese were never very happy with this resolution. You know, how did our island become important only as a kind of base for somebody else's nation-building project? So for decades, you had a lot of conflict and tension in Taiwan over Taiwan's future, but the day-to-day reality was there's one government in Taiwan, the Republic of China, and another government in the People's Republic of China. They've talked about, and it's a high priority for the People's Republic of China, to bring these two back together under a single flag. But for a lot of people in Taiwan, they don't see how they would benefit from being united with the mainland.
Explain to us why Beijing is so adamant about wanting to reincorporate Taiwan and why the territorial issue is so important.
That is a great question, and my answer to that question has changed over time. You know, there was a time when I believed that there was a strong economic component. Back before China's economic takeoff, Taiwan had already experienced an economic takeoff, so I think there was some attraction to, you know, get into the Taiwan economy. Today, Taiwan and China are each other's, you know, at the very top of one another's trading and investing ranks. They are completely intertwined economically. So there's no, you know, China's getting all the benefits of the Taiwanese economy without political unification. So today my answer is really that the Chinese Communist Party has for about 30 years, maybe a little bit longer, made this a very high priority. And part of the reason it's a very high priority for them politically is they see Taiwan as a vestige of the days when China was not powerful enough to defend its own interests. So they would say, why is Taiwan separate from the mainland? Well, because of Japanese colonialism and American military protection. And both of those things are sort of violations in the view of people in the PRC of their national sovereignty. So they've made it really important to the legitimacy of the Communist Party to prevent Taiwan from moving farther away and to maintain as a long-term objective bringing Taiwan into the PRC. What I think that where that runs into difficulty is that people in Taiwan just don't see it that way. You know, they don't understand why the fact that in the past Taiwan was associated with China means that it has to be politically associated with China in the future. You know, they're more on a democratic model now where they get to pick their own leaders. So there's a sort of mismatch in almost political philosophy between the two sides that makes it all the more difficult then for the Chinese to kind of own this issue in the way they need to for their own domestic politics.
Now, if President Ma had not won re-election, there was a very good chance that Taiwan would have moved apart from China more so than it had been.
Well, it's hard to say because the president from 2000 to 2008 was bound and determined to pull Taiwan away from the mainland. But the net result of his 8 years of presidency is that Taiwan and China are more economically integrated than ever. And the sort of political imperative for good relations, not necessarily for, you know, unification, but for good relations is stronger than ever. So 8 years of, you know, frantically looking for a way out of this box, and he never found one. So I think if his own party had won the election in March 2012, they would have been not exactly back at square one, because I think they learned a lot of lessons from those 8 years, but I think they would have been more modest in their goals.
And so the threat that has always been there, that if Taiwan were to break away, that China would do something in a military mode. Do you think that's receded?
I think the possibility of Taiwan actually saying, all right, that's it. We've been separated for 60 years, and really we've been separated for 115 odd or 117 years. We had a little reconciliation for 4 years there in the middle, but we've been separated for over 100 years. Let's just get a divorce. This is what the Chinese government and the Chinese political leadership cannot tolerate, right? They've tolerated separation for a really long time. So when they say they can't tolerate that, I say, well, you've tolerated it since 1949. And before that, you tolerated it from 1895 to 1945. But the divorce is different. Because the divorce means we're not getting back together. There's no chance of reconciliation. For a long time, from about 1990 to around 2000, which in the grand scheme of all of this history is actually not that long, I think there were a significant number of politically powerful Taiwanese who thought there should be a way to get a divorce. We should be able to find a way to make that happen. Today, I don't think anybody who is in a serious position in Taiwan believes that you could finalize this divorce and not have the whole house come crashing down, to mix a metaphor. Yep. So I'm not worried about Taiwan declaring independence, but the Beijing leadership says they are. And so they continue to have a military buildup. They continue to, sort of have a stick hanging over to go along with the carrots that they use to try to bring Taiwan closer in, because they think there's still the possibility that they're going to wake up one day and find that they've been served with divorce papers. And that is their greatest fear.
Do you think unification is something that is likely? I know the Chinese have offered the Taiwanese a special arrangement similar to what they offered Hong Kong, but with even more freedoms and flexibility, but there hasn't been any interest to date. Do you think that they could come up with a package of proposals that Taiwan would agree to and say, okay, we're ready? Or perhaps the political system in China itself would evolve that would make something like this possible?
I think the most likely possibility for actually, reconciling these two families is not to use the kind of nuclear family model, so mom and dad move back to the same house, but maybe a kind of traditional Chinese family model where we have a courtyard in the middle of two wings of the same house. You live with your family on one side, and I live with my family on the other side. Some things maybe we coordinate our decision making, and we certainly share our family finances. But I have my wife and kids over here, you have your wife and kids over there. But we do have in between, at the back of the courtyard, our ancestral table and our ancestral shrine, where we both acknowledge that we are members in some sense of the same family. So China doesn't have to be the People's Republic of China or the Republic of China, parentheses, Taiwan. China can transcend either of these two modern states. So I think if there were an arrangement that said, we're going to both be part of China, but we're not going to be under the same government. I'm not going to control you, you're not going to control me, that might be acceptable. But I will tell you that when I suggest this to my friends in Taiwan who are part of that generation who imagined moving out, that's very hard for them to accept. So the time is not right, I think, to move a proposal like that forward, but it could be down the line.
And what if China were to evolve dramatically in a direction of political reform? There are some people who have talked about the big Taiwan scenario for China. Mm-hmm. Would that accelerate the likelihood of reunification?
Taiwanese politicians for a long time have made democratization in China a prerequisite for unification. So even President Ma, who is certainly the preferred choice for the Beijing leadership, has been very clear, we're not going to unify with an authoritarian, Marxist-Leninist, Mao thoughtist PRC. So democratization, I think, is kind of a prerequisite, but we don't know what democracy in China would look like. So I think a lot of people in Taiwan would not want to say, oh, if China becomes democratic, then everything's going to be fine, because democracies go in all kinds of surprising directions. We've seen that in Egypt. We've seen that in Russia. It's not always the case that two democracies necessarily can adequately respect one another's uniqueness. We don't ask New Zealand to allow itself to be absorbed into a democratic Australia, even though they're each other's number one trading partners. They speak the same language. They have the same colonial and pre-colonial history. Sometimes democracy is not enough to protect the minority from the will of the majority. And I think a lot of Taiwanese increasingly worry that nationalism in China has developed to such a point that there would be pressure on them, even in a fully democratic China, to subordinate their interests to those of the nation, the larger nation.
Help us understand how all of this affects the United States and its interests. At one time, the United States had a bilateral security agreement with Taiwan, and that's been replaced for many years now by something much more vague. What is the nature of that agreement? What does it commit the United States to do, and what does it not do?
The U.S. first got involved in all of this during the Korean War, right? When we said, oh my gosh, communism's on the move everywhere, both continents. So we gotta protect our flanks wherever we have them. So at the beginning of the Korean War, the U.S. kind of jumped into the Taiwan Strait and prevented the Red Army, Mao's, what we call now the People's Liberation Army, from crossing the Taiwan Strait and finishing the job, so to speak, by wiping out the Republic of China on Taiwan. So from the beginning, the U.S. kind of took the position that in the Cold War era, right, where we are anti-communist, we're siding with the Republic of China on Taiwan and giving at least some lip service to the hope that they will eventually solve this communism problem on the mainland. Well, that was very quickly shown to be an unrealistic goal for the U.S. So the U.S. kind of just let the situation lie, discouraged Chiang Kai-shek from actually antagonizing the PRC or taking advantage of moments that he saw as opportunities to solve the communism problem on the mainland and so on. Fast forward to the 1970s, the U.S. begins to realize China is not the younger brother of the Soviet Union. In fact, China is a potential source of leverage and cooperation for the U.S. in the Cold War. So Nixon goes to China and says, let's normalize our relationship, U.S. and Beijing. And the Beijing government said, well, you can't recognize us and the other side at the same time. And the U.S. really finessed that from the very beginning. We said, okay, whatever, you guys work it out. We just don't want you to fight about it, but we're not going to get in the way of whatever resolution you want to do. Fast forward again to 1979, when the U.S. and China are finalizing the normalization of diplomatic relations. And the U.S. Congress says, whoa, wait a minute, you can't just abandon Taiwan like that. So the U.S. negotiator went into Deng Xiaoping and he said, there's going to have to be some relationship between Washington and Taipei, even after normalization. We're not going to recognize the ROC as a state, but we're not going to just ignore, we're not going to pretend they don't exist. And one of the things that's probably going to happen is we're probably going to continue selling arms to the Taiwanese military. And according to historians, Deng Xiaoping had a little fit. But at the end of his fit, he said, all right. So normalization went ahead with the Chinese very disappointed, but nonetheless understanding that the U.S. would continue to have a relationship with Taiwan. That gets enshrined in 1979 in the Taiwan Relations Act, which governs our relationship with Taiwan, which says we don't recognize the Republic of China as a country, but we will treat them as a country for all purposes, except sort of official government-to-government relations. And we will continue to ensure that they are capable of defending themselves and that we are capable of defending them should a U.S. president think that is in the interest of the U.S. So we don't have an ironclad security commitment to Taiwan. We never said we'll defend you no matter what. What we said was we will be cognizant of your defense needs, we will supply your defense needs, and we will maintain our ability to intervene if we think that's the right thing to do. So we've never really taken a side, but the result of that is that both sides are disappointed. The Chinese feel like when you switched recognition, you should have switched it all the way and gotten out of this dispute. And the Taiwanese think, you know, we were your best ally. We did everything you asked us to do. We became a market capitalist, export-oriented economy that has supplied you with everything from, you know, toenail clippers to iPads. And we became a democracy. And you're still talking about, you know, walking away from us. Not to say that US governments talk about walking away from Taiwan, because they don't. The US official position has been very consistent, that we are sticking to this, what we call strategic ambiguity, that we're not taking a side. But it's a refrain in kind of academic discourse and punditry to ask, you know, can we afford this Taiwan thing anymore? So neither side is happy with us.
So in the event of a crisis, if there were the threat of military action, we just don't know what the U.S. might do?
We don't know what the U.S. would do in the event of a crisis because we shouldn't know what the U.S. is going to do in the event of a crisis, right? You never want to be so committed that if your ally acts crazy, you're still stuck going in. And in formal military alliances, this can get really dicey. It's really dicey with Israel right now, right? Israel toying with attacking Iran. As the ally, could we actually say, we're not going to help you if you do that? We think that's a bad decision and we're not going to follow you into that hornet's nest. We have to maintain some ability to independently decide what is in the interest of the United States in any alliance relationship. But it is the more formal the alliance and the more joint your militaries are, the harder that is. So one of the things that Taiwan would like to do is to create kind of tripwires for U.S.-Taiwan military cooperation such that the U.S. really would be unable to refrain from becoming involved. The kind of tripwires that we have with Korea, right? If North Korea attacks South Korea, Americans are on the front lines. There's no way for the U.S. not to be involved. And that is a huge deterrent to North Korea taking action. They know they can't attack the South and, you know, get away with it. They're going to face the U.S. no matter what they do. We don't have that tripwire with Taiwan. And we don't have that tripwire with Taiwan because we want to make sure that Taiwan doesn't act precipitously or unwisely. And I think that's actually a smart policy.
Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Rigger.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.
This program is made possible, in part, by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India Center at UCF.